Now, defense ministers from dozens of states, including NATO countries, will be meeting this Friday at Germany's Ramstein air base. The gathering comes as pressure mounts on Berlin over what military equipment it is and isn't willing to supply Ukraine. Chancellor Olaf Scholz is under pressure from EU allies to allow the export of Germany's Leopard tanks, even from third countries. We can now bring in Dr. Rod Thornton, Research Fellow in the Defence Studies Department at King's College London. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. Why is there this reluctance on Germany's part to supply tanks to Ukraine?
I think it's basically a desire not to offend Russia too much, to maintain a kind of decent relationship with Moscow, with Putin. Otherwise, if you don't maintain, from a German point of view, if you don't maintain a good relationship or reasonably good relationship with Putin, then you can't have any leverage over him. You can't persuade him to do certain things to restrict his activities in Ukraine. So I think if Germany does allow the supply of Leopard 2 tanks, then I think the bridges with Moscow, with Putin, are going to be broken. And I think that's what the German government is most afraid of.
Let's talk about this for a second, because a year ago, in February or March, it would have been unthinkable to supply Ukraine with tanks, Leopard tanks, or what have you. France is now supplying tanks. The UK is supplying tanks. Actions which would have been considered provocative back then seem to be okay now. Why is that?
I think there's a desire on the part of Western governments to try and find some resolution to this war, but not a resolution that suits Russia. That to push the Russian forces back, to put pressure on them, so Putin is put in a position whereby if his forces are on the back foot, he has to kind of sue for peace before it gets even more serious for Russian forces on the ground in Ukraine. So the whole idea of using offensive systems like main battle tanks is now back on the agenda because of the war is in a stalemate situation, and I think Western governments do not want a situation the situation in Ukraine to drag on for kind of several months, if not years.
So what would Moscow consider a red line today?
Well, we don't know yet. We do not know how Putin will react to the supply of offensive systems like main battle tanks. He will escalate, I think, but that's what kind of escalation will he engage in? And that's the problem for Western governments. If they take this action, this kind of provocative action in supplying these main battle tanks, then what will Russia do? Putin isn't going to sit still and take this. He's going to do something, but what? And then the Western governments have to take into account what is escalation management. If the Russians escalate, what then do Western governments do?
The Russians have said they are in a proxy war with NATO. Last week, we had Washington, which came out and said they will be training Ukrainian soldiers with how to operate their Patriot missile defense systems. Is that a further escalation, do you think, the fact that Ukrainian soldiers will be trained on NATO soil?
Ukrainian soldiers are already being trained on NATO soil across Europe and in the United States already. So that's not it's the provocative action there is the Ukrainians being trained to use the Patriot. And once the Patriot system is being used in Ukraine and does start then have an effect on the delivery of Russian missiles, then the Russians will be kind of, again, provoked into doing something. But that won't be for several months. It's going to take several months to train the Ukrainians to use the Patriot system and for that system then to be deployed in Ukraine.
Do you think we're seeing EU allies, well, barring Germany for now, upping the ante with what they're willing to supply Kyiv? Because, as you mentioned, that there's this period of stalemate and they think that pushing the envelope just a little bit with what they're willing to supply Ukraine could mean Ukraine has the upper hand when and if the time comes for talks with Moscow?
Well, that's going to be several months down the line. These main battle tanks, the troops have to be trained to use them, and they're quite complicated systems. You can't just take a few guys from Ukraine and train them up in a couple of weeks to use these main battle tanks. It's going to take several months before these tanks become operational in Ukraine if they are supplied by Germany. At the moment, the number of tanks supplied by the UK will not make a difference, and also the number of tanks and the type of tank, the light tank supplied by France, will not make a difference. The big difference maker is the Leopard 2 supplied to Ukraine in the hundreds, and that will have an effect, but not for several months. So there's a bit of manoeuvre room between now and when these tanks will be deployed in Ukraine, if they are. So there's time for some sort of diplomacy to take place and some sort of maybe a ratcheting down of the tensions between the West and Moscow in that intervening period.
I want to ask you about today's helicopter crash for a second, because we had Vladimir Zelensky who came out and called this a terrible tragedy. I don't know if you heard our correspondent there earlier who I spoke to mention that there was fog today. We don't have Moscow saying anything. Could Moscow be behind this?
I doubt it. I think it's just an accident, basically. That helicopter would have been flying low to avoid Russian anti-aircraft systems and Russian aircraft. So it would be flying as low as possible to the ground. And if you start flying over urban areas in poor visibility, like fog, you're going to run the risk of clipping tall buildings. And I think that's what happened here. So in Brovary, there's that very tall building, which I think the helicopter, its rotor blades would have clipped that building, and that would have brought it down. So from my mind, it is purely an accident, but I'm just speculating.
Very briefly, and final question to you. You mentioned that there needs to be a ratcheting down of tensions before there any kind of dialogue between the two sides. What would that entail, a ratcheting down of tensions? Because right now we're not seeing that. We're going to have defense ministers meet at Germany's Ramstein Air Base this coming Friday, and they're going to promise more to Ukraine, billions of dollars in aid potentially. So what does ratcheting down look like?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I can only see a ratcheting up of tensions over the next few months. But who knows what might happen in Moscow, what Putin might do in the future, what pressure he might come under from his own government, his own military. Who knows? So it's at the moment, the tensions are only going to increase, not decrease. So that's the problem going forward, yeah?
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Rod Thornton there.
Thank you.